So more than thinking of what do psychedelics do is how are we working with psychedelics? Because we don't go just to see a spectacle of things, a movie that will play out, in the exterior of ourselves. We are pretty much active agents that interact with the psychedelics.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I'm your host, as always, James W. Jesso. This is a podcast that explores topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research, and always with the underlying question of how do we work with and through our psychedelic experiences to become better people, not just for ourselves, but for all those with whom we are nested in relationship. Today's episode deals with integration, a term that many of you are probably familiar with, as it is now incredibly common in the sort of larger psychedelic discourse to refer to integration as the essential component of what allows us to carry the sort of experiences we have on psychedelics into something practical into our lives, or at the very least to, kind of disentangle ourselves after a difficult experience. However, what integration is specifically, what it looks like, what it takes, and when it is that integration is done, like when we're successfully integrated, that's not so clear. Thankfully, today's episode features someone who is quite versed in answering these sort of questions and disambiguating integration, and that's Mijal Schmidt. And we're going to talk about integration generally, but specifically, we're going to be talking about integrating ayahuasca experiences. So before we start the interview, I will read you Mijal's bio so you get a sense of where she is coming from. Mijal Schmidt is a clinical psychologist with a master's in psychoanalysis and musicology. She has been working in the clinical field for over 15 years and as an integration psychotherapist for over 5 years. She collaborates with different international organizations such as ICEERS as an integration psychotherapist and was just appointed as the clinical director at Nectera. Her experimentation with master plants, as she calls them, for personal exploration started around 10 years ago, and in her own words, quote, "The closeness with traditional practices from Mexico and Peru have opened perceptual dimensions in me which continue to inform my clinical practice and feed my everyday life. In this regard, I'm a blend of traditional teachings and contemporary theoretical approaches, which helps me broaden the understanding of how to bridge these knowledge and produce possibilities with the people who look to integration to making sense of their work with master plants." End quote. So a little heads up on the content of this interview. It's going to present a rather robust exploration of what psychedelic integration is and the specifics of what an ayahuasca integration requires. We talk about the importance of good preparation and what that looks like, various integration practices and activities, the most common challenges in integrating ayahuasca experiences, including huge experiences and difficult experiences. We will talk about the integration of experiences that seem to be encounters with exogenous material entities or even the sort of absorption of other people's processes. And we'll also be discussing how to know when we've successfully completed our integration of a particular journey. In the midst of the interview, we also explore the difference between psychedelic integration and psychotherapy, learning to accept what is happening in our journeys, even if we don't like it or want it or think it's what we're supposed to be experiencing. And we will also cover how to support someone in post-psychedelic crisis and when to intervene for their safety. So that's what the interview is going to offer today. Before we get into it, a big thank you to my patrons on Patreon, especially the people whose names are listed on the screen here in YouTube or in the description to this episode. wherever you're checking it out. If you are finding value in the show and you are not yet a patron, please consider heading over to patreon.com/James W. Jesso, which is linked in the description here, and become a patron. You can become a patron for free if you just like to follow me there and make sure you're staying up to date on the content that I am releasing without having to rely on the sort of larger algorithms of most social media. Or you could sign up as a paid member of the Patreon to support the show financially, be involved on that level, as well as to be included in the sort of spread of things that are not freely available to people outside of the paid Patreon community. If you're looking to just do a one-time donation to the show, you can do so via PayPal. Links to that are in the description of this episode. But either way, I would love it if you're finding value in the show to reciprocate that value by joining me on Patreon financially, ideally, but non-financially is also great. Thank you very much in advance for doing so. And without much further ado, here is my interview with Mijal Schmidt on Adventures Through the Mind, episode 183. Enjoy. Mijal Schmidt, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind.
Hi, James. Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
So I was first exposed to your work, or I guess your perspective, as a part of a course that I've been taking through ICEERS. The course is on the, I can't remember the name, but basically, best practices within, ayahuasca facilitation in non-traditional context, something to this effect. I'm not an ayahuasca facilitator, but I'm in the scene, and I also often end up being reached out to people, and so by people who are in trouble post their experiences. So I wanted to get informed on what the sort of perspective is from ICEERS, given that they're such a reputable organization. That's how I got exposed to your work as somebody who is working with the ICEERS support line. But you're also someone who works in private practice with respect to psychedelic integration. I'm wondering if you could start us off by first giving us a little quick rundown of like what the ICEERS Support Center is, and your private practice, how they differ, and from what perspective you're going to be, sharing today.
Sure. So the work that I do within the help center in ICEERS is from a framework that's part of the same organization. They created this framework of integration, although I have my own perspective to bring to the table, and that's a very interesting side of it because it is open to me bringing my own perspective, although with certain guidelines, right? And it looks like it's open for people who have had experiences with psychedelics. Generally speaking, I would work with people who had a difficult experience, although not only, because also people who are wanting to prepare for an intake, regardless of the psychedelic of their choice. They can come and they can request some sessions to prepare for their journeys. But as I said, generally speaking, what I work with the most is people who just went into a journey and there were certain conditions that were not precisely met, or there were difficulties during either the preparation or the intake, and then they're coming to integrate. A lot of them are people who might find themselves in a sort of crisis post intake. A lot of people also just come to have a perspective of integration, of a particular kind of integration, right? Because there are so many around the world nowadays. And they connect to the website. They connect with us through the website. They request sessions through a questionnaire that they fill up in the website, and then they're led to me. The English-speaking people are led to me, and I, depending on the situation that I hear, I can offer a number of sessions for each person. So it is pretty much tailored to the particular situation that they're going through. There's a lot of discussion around the world, I would say, about what is integration, what is a perspective from which we work. And I think that there are so many perspectives. And so to answer your question about what's the difference with my practice, with my private practice, is that since I'm a psychologist and I do psychotherapy, the difference is that people who come to my private practice, I help them integrate, if that's what they came here for. And it is something that can become a psychotherapy later on after having integrated the contents, particularly related to the journey. Whereas in the service, in the help center, we don't turn this into a psychotherapy, since this is focalized only in integrating the contents from the journey. So that will be one of the main differences, that in my private practice, I have the possibility to touch on certain elements that I can find are related to other periods of time of the people who consult me. And we can go a little bit broader in certain aspects. And since I know that I will be working with them for longer. In the help center, we do have a limit of the sessions that we can offer. So those would be some of the differences. And of course, I would say that the depth to which we can work in certain contents changes as well. There are, like to say an example, there are things that I wouldn't go into if I know that I'm only going to work with one person for 10 sessions. Whereas if I'm working with someone on a weekly basis, then I have the opportunity to, touch on certain things that I know I will have the time to work on a long time. So, because there are certain things that if are open during the therapeutic session, might need more time to unfold, but particularly to give follow-up. So I would say that's the main difference.
And just to clarify for people who are listening, the the ICEERS support hotline, the integration center, there's no upfront cost for people calling. It is funded through private donation. Is that correct?
That's correct. And people can donate. If people went into a series of sessions and they have the opportunity to donate, they can afterwards.
So I assume today you're going to be speaking, less so from within just your ICEERS work, and more sort of like as a psychologist who works with psychedelic integration, as well as other things that can come up through psychedelic experiences, which have nothing to do with the psychedelics themselves. You'll be speaking from this sort of the full scope of your practice, not necessarily just to your work within ICEERS. Is that correct?
Yes. That's a great point of view to work on. Yeah.
So before I get into the first question, which will be very specifically about psychedelic integration, is there a particular style, format, or a school of therapy that you tend to work from? For example, there's internal family systems, or Gestalt therapy, or CBT, or DBT. Like, is there something specific that sort of is like what you would consider your sort of general wheelhouse as a psychologist?
Sure. I mean, I'm a clinical psychologist, and then I have training in psychoanalysis, particularly from the French school. So Yeah, that's mostly my perspective, but I do modify a lot of the ways in which I intervene because I also have training in crisis intervention and therapeutic accompaniment, and those have different frameworks. And so that depends on who I'm working with and what the situation is. I might as well use certain strategies that are not specifically to a particular theory or practice because it very much depends on how and what the needs are in the moment. So, of course, I wouldn't apply an open perspective as I would if I have the time or if someone comes, with existential questions. I wouldn't use the same strategy as if someone is coming with a crisis that requires me to act quickly to set certain baseline for this person to be able to live, to be able to continue working or to. So I've been a clinician for many years, so that allows me to, choose the strategies that are the most convenient for each person, depending on their background, depending on the culture, depending on the psychedelic, depending on their experience, depending on a lot of other things.
Hmm. Okay, so let's get into some questions explicitly. Pardon my movement. I got a wobble stool recently, keeping my mobility good. But yeah, so let's get into questions specifically about integrating psychedelics. One of the perspectives I've come to understand over the years is that if one is fortunate enough or sort of like experienced enough or have others around them that are experienced enough, they recognize that preparation is sort of the best first step to a good integration experiences. Now, specifically to ayahuasca, before we start asking about integration in particular, is there anything that you've come to learn over the years to be sort of like, I guess, best practices for people with respect to preparing for an ayahuasca experience?
I love this question actually, because generally speaking, we would say, like, yes, you should come to sessions. And then I have my own perspective of how to prepare. And I am, of course, developing my own method. And within my method, what I say is, okay, let's establish what are your stones. And let's set your stones in a cartography so that you map out what's your history in to the extent that you're going to work, right, with the elements that you're going to work in the session, not the whole story of someone, but the main elements to work on, and also the elements that are most problematic, because these mapping of these elements allows you to, when you're in the session, remember your reasons why, your intention, if you had one, and be able to also allow yourself to wander around with other reasons that come up, but also being able to grab your stones back to ground yourself during the intake if it gets too strong. So for me, setting stones is one of the most important aspects to preparing. It also allows me to understand if someone is where they're at regarding their own history and how they are navigating their own history of whether that be trauma, whether that be, just other problematic situations or not that they have encountered throughout their lives. And that allows me also to understand how to guide that preparation and point out certain elements that they can take with them to the ceremony or to the intake, to take into account, to have them, to prime their mind with, because I think priming the mind is important. Of course, sometimes you can just go open with an open mind and open heart and just see what you encounter, I would say that that practice is more recommended for people who already have experiences with psychedelics. But why I say that I love this question very much is because I've come to the conclusion that if you have been doing work on yourself, the way in which you will be prepared to encounter the elements that you will during an intake, they're less likely to be as tough as someone who has no clue whatsoever of what their lives are, right?
As in, like, the difference between being sort of like knowing you're stepping in to encounter something difficult and being totally caught off guard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, because a lot of people nowadays, they come with me and they say, like, I just want to go into the psychedelic journey because I'm sure that the psychedelic's just going to save my life. It's just going to kind of shift, my whole perspective, and tomorrow I will be a different person. And it's a lot of work to actually get them to understand how psychedelics work and to get them to recognize that these are not magic pills, although a lot of people can have breakthroughs. It's a lot of work, and it's a very interesting and beautiful work, but it can also be something that's very confrontative, and that you will need other resources to face this confrontation with things that you probably never knew were there. So I've seen that the people who have been working on themselves, whether it be with, therapy along life or sometime, or whether they, are gifted enough or conscious enough to be able to grasp certain things that are bothering them, if they have this clarity or at least, some information about it, they're less likely to have a breakdown, let's call it this way, or remain in a crisis.
Or, perhaps get ultimately nothing out of the experience other than a big shebang and, back to square one a month later. So you're using the term psychedelics. Is there anything specific about ayahuasca, like that it, say, differs from other psychedelics with respect to preparation, other than, I think, what most people would assume, the baseline of being careful with the contraindications between some of the components of the ayahuasca pharmacologically with various medications? Save that. That's very easily accessed information. But from this sort of like setting the stones or getting a sense of the stones preparations, or anything about ayahuasca in particular that calls a sort of special something or a unique something out of the process that differs from other psychedelics?
Well, if we take into account that ayahuasca takes a lot of time, you're in the journey for a lot of hours. So it does require a lot of stamina to be able to, experience these up and downs that you can experience during a journey, and to navigate what you're told, so to speak, by ayahuasca. A lot of people, to understand that there are things that are not necessarily literal is just very important. A lot of people don't know this before getting into a journey, and they, have this question after in the integration, like, but I was told to do this, I was told to, shift this aspect of my life completely, and I don't know how to do it, I don't know where to, etc. And I think it is useful to know that we kind of need a neutral sort of, if that's possible, right? Because absolute neutrality is impossible, but, certain cautious of how we listen to what we listen during an intake, so that we just don't go with it as if that was the ultimate truth, but rather to understand how to navigate the contents with which, perspective and position, subjective position, to listen to what we listen. In that regard, understanding how projection works is important. How a lot of other mechanisms, I would say, work in the way in which we confront the experience is very important. And I would say that the functioning of the plant in itself as what is purging is just very important for people to know beforehand. And what are the waves that they can find during the intake? Because some people get really frightened about extreme purging, or some people get in the wave of that they have to purge for the whole planet, right? And I would say that understanding that we're not merciless, and that our agency is not given away when we work with plants is just very important to know. Particularly with ayahuasca, because ayahuasca has mysterious ways to work, and it can, take different sides to show us things. The ayahuasca is not necessarily sometimes it is a very frontal, a very straightforward plant, and sometimes it's mischievous and goes around and shows you just other things first. So I think that you learned it by doing, of course, by having the experience and understanding the character of the plant, which is something that traditional people do. They go to the jungle and they do dietas for years, because the most important part is to establish a relationship with the plant. Rather than simply knowing the effects, what they aim for is to establish such a relationship, which is a very particular relationship. It's not the same with everyone. So that they ultimately understand what they're being told, and sometimes as well, what are the moves that they must do, or what are the positions they must take in regards to the plant. So this communication with the plant, for me, is one of the most important aspects to work with ayahuasca.
And it's, like you said, it's something that is really learned over time, but having a sort of baseline understanding that there, like you said, there's some agency involved. Things aren't necessarily literal. From what I understand, rarely they are that literal. And that there's this, like you said, position. There's like a kind of opportunity space that one can choose to move within, rather than just be entirely subjected to the authority of the plant. Did I get that correctly?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to tell a bit of a gross story. Maybe not gross for you. You've probably heard a whole gambit of things. But speaking of agency, I once had an experience with ayahuasca where it was very clear that it needed me to go into the bathroom with my headlamp and explore my purge in my bucket. I had to look at it. I had to pick it up. I had to touch it. And so I was like, okay, sure. All right. And I did that. And then I washed my hands and I took a pee, and then ayahuasca was like, now you should explore your pee in the toilet. And I was like, no, ayahuasca, too far. And it was just like, okay. Anyways, exactly. that little story aside, I just want to clarify, you're saying intake. When you say intake, what you mean is the experience of having ingested the ayahuasca or the psychedelic compound. You're in the experience pharmacologically and otherwise of having ingested. Is that correct?
Exactly. Because if we talk about ceremony, not everyone is having a psychedelic within the setting of the ceremony. So when I refer to intake, it's just basically any setting. It's just, the experience of having a psychedelic, which I do consider that the setting is important and it changes everything. Yes. But for, practical reasons here, I do refer to intake as the journey in itself.
So I want to get now into integration. And And the question is like, what exactly is integration? But before that, I think it would be interesting to hear from your perspective, as a clinical psychologist and somebody who's obviously not just a clinical psychologist who took the weekend course in what ayahuasca is and then pretending as though you know how to help people integrate the experience. Like you're a long-standing, deeply experienced person with this kind of integration work. What is your perspective on what an ayahuasca experience is for the mind?
A very interesting question. I think that we need to take into consideration, and this is why I think it's very important, that ultimately the work with psychedelics is done with the contents and on the contents of someone's life. So more than thinking of what do psychedelics do, is how are we working with psychedelics? Because we don't go just to see a spectacle of things, a movie that will play out, in the exterior of ourselves. We are pretty much active agents that interact with the psychedelics. So whatever we are shown during the journey is something that we already have. It is something that there is in our minds, that it is in our history. So we don't go anew, right, into an intake regardless of the psychedelic we take. But in the case of ayahuasca, it's very interesting to think that, let's say, in the comparison with iboga, for example, the elements that we find, like the snake-like images and the fractals that we see during an intake of ayahuasca are very different than from the ones that we find with an iboga intake, which are basically related to the region and to the cosmology. And this is for me something that's very interesting to note, because we can say that, of course, and I think need to take into account that plants are, and the whole experience is also embedded culturally. And with that, we will find certain elements related to culture, related to the particular cosmology that we're working on. However, when we get in contact with the psychedelic, in this case ayahuasca, I think that we're taken. You mean mentally, in terms of how we experience the effects?
I think you can run with it however you want to interpret it. Okay. Yeah.
I think that we're taken through. I think it depends a lot on the purpose that we have. But let's say that we don't have a purpose. Let's say that we just go about it as, I just want to see what I find, right? And I don't think that's just left to, absolute freedom. I think that the work with ayahuasca is a game of projection and introjection. So we most likely will find things that we fear, things that we love as well, things that we want to find in the world, things that we're trying to avoid. A lot of the things that we find are things that are already in our lives that probably were strong enough that we couldn't really process, and it might as well come to the surface, which is something that happens often. But also, we encounter things that we thought we didn't want to find, that we have been trying, to avoid, as I said. And also, one of the effects that I find most, fun is that sometimes someone says, I don't want to find this thing. I don't want to get in touch with my fear. And we basically find fear in every single form. And this is exactly what we prime our minds with. It is before the intake, I mean, there have been experiments where people are told several things before the ceremony, and that's basically what they find throughout the journey. And this is an effect that we can understand as the sensitivity that our minds have to words, to contents, and also the ways in which we deposit responsibility and power over people who are going to run the ceremony or the intake. And we kind of follow the information that the facilitator in this case gives us, and we incorporate it into our journey. I can also say that journeys are dreamlike, or they're representations that work as dreams at the same time. And sometimes, from my perspective, that I work with dreams and I work with the unconscious, they provide a richness that we wouldn't find in any other practice, because there are symbols, but there are this, I emphasize projection because it's something that I find all the time. And when you give this back to someone in integration, let's say so, and they are able to relate it to their own lives, then the focus of the exterior of the message, when they can change it to the interior, everything shifts, because it's like, oh, I didn't realize that this was part of my life, and that this was something that I was looking into or that I rejected before. So this is it's this game, I would say, of reading, which is basically what I do in my work. I am a reader of contents.
So you talked about sort of almost like something becomes possible that wasn't possible before when during integration, someone is able to sort of like turn what they thought was an external experience and realize that it was an internal experience. I might be jumping the gun here a little bit in our discussion, but with all of what you just described, it was very much a discussion of internal contents, right? You had mentioned projection and interjection. Well, what of experiences that are seemingly totally outside of you? There's a very long-standing history in many sort of indigenous plant cosmologies or plant ceremony cosmologies, and just general cosmologies, as well as increasingly represented around the world, that sees that there are very much exogenous, seemingly freestanding things that we can interact with that aren't projections of our own mind. Do you factor that into your understanding of ayahuasca as well, or do you sort of hold that as a uniquely cultural thing, and that's not necessarily what you work with in your practice?
You see, I do take it into account for sure. In my own experience, I've worked with it as well. It is hard, though, to work with it with people in an integration session. On one hand, I work with psychosis, so this element can very easily turn into simply hallucinations, which are not, right? But giving this back to someone in crisis, it's a very delicate thing to do, because if they are cursing a psychotic breakdown, these can lead them just to something that they won't be able to kind of stabilize. And the stabilization of psychosis is a very difficult thing to do. And we must be very careful on how we integrate these elements. However, yes, I think that that is one of the elements that we get to understand, that we get to know how to work with experience, in terms of what do we do with these elements, right? Are these elements here to give us messages? Are these elements, the differentiation between projection and these external or exogenous elements are, that's like the delicate thing to do at first. But then once you know that these are external elements, how do I relate to them? What do I do with what I receive? Because I do know that there is transference, not in the psychoanalytic way, in the general way of saying it, in a ceremony of others people's contents. So someone can
as in other people's contents can be simply by whatever things are happening that are less than explainable by material science. Their experiences can be transferred into our subjective experience.
Yes.
And it is kind of external, but it's the external, the encounter of the external subjectivity of somebody else. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Some people say that, and this is part of my thesis with Icaros, that there is this sort of lattice, is called, like this woven, space around us where these elements kind of communicate. And so that those are elements that are in the space, and we get acquainted with these other elements. And then there are other phenomena that probably we can't really explain easily, as in how are these contents transmitted. But what we do know, and what I've heard in my clinical experiences, people coming to say, well, there was this content that it's not mine. And I'm talking about people who've experienced this kind of work. So they're more or less acquainted with how this, works. And they can say that they don't recognize certain elements, that they didn't know where these things came from. And at the end, when they did the kind of integration they did, after the intake, it happened to be someone there that shared that this problem or a specific situation was happening to this person, and they didn't know. The whole group didn't know. So there is this element in the group that can be shared, and that will be, the sort of the tangible thing to say, right? Because if we get into notions more like, spirits or other kinds of elements, entities, and all these things, a lot of people feel them, a lot of people relate to them, but how do we know? I think that when we work in traditional settings, and not only in traditional, but I think it's harder to find in non-traditional settings, that people, facilitators, are prepared enough to work with these elements. But in traditional ceremonies, I've found that curanderos or facilitators, they pretty much need to do something with this element so that they really don't install themselves in the whole dynamic.
Yes, very, very, very interesting. I mean, a couple of things come up. One, I don't remember entirely. I'm certainly, not confident that it's true, but I remember something Terence McKenna, I think, used to say about like early ayahuasca. They called them, or ayahuasca research, they were calling the active component like telepathine or something, because of the sort of sense of the shared group experience and the sort of seemingly like telepathic types of connections. Mm-hmm. But I think what really brings to mind here is, and I'm going a little bit off the rails with respect to the questions, is just the recognition of how much mystery there still is in all of this. Perhaps mystery that is, A, not possible to be, and B, not in service, not of good service to try to conquer with a full conceptual understanding of the phenomenon, so much as the pragmatic, like how do we work with the impact of that phenomenon on the individual who encountered it, such that it leads to, at the very least, neutrality, if not positive outcomes, rather than negative outcomes or destabilizing outcomes. And the sort of general, I guess the general track I'm experiencing when I'm watching the sort of mainstreaming of psychedelics is the sort of like really convenient sort of characterizing it in an exclusively psychological internal projection of your own mind, psychologization, framework. Nice, neat, cleanly packaged, no edges on the thing, fits right into that little box called the mainstream. But yet there's this whole other thing. And I really appreciate you speaking to it. Yeah.
I hope I'm not hang up because I know it's a difficult topic. I mean, I'm a clinical psychologist from a Western perspective, but I very much appreciate, and I've worked with traditional curanderos, and for me, my personal project is blending in these two perspectives and being able to consider the traditional aspects of the work with plants, because I don't think that it is enough. I don't think that the psychological side of it is enough. And I would say that regardless if it's enough or not, if we cut out, what tradition has done with plants, we're missing out from a very profound, not only tradition, of course, and I might be repeating myself, but there's a whole history of the work with, and I'm not going to say psychedelics in this case, I'm going to say sacred plants, master plants, because the work that they used to do and are still doing in some communities, it's a secular practice in a way. The sacrality is a very rooted one. What we're experiencing in the Western world is this mystification of things that, as symbols, I know they help with the experience, but when you go to work with, traditional communities, they consider the air, and they consider the water, and they take into account the earth and dust, and just very simple everyday elements that we work with, that we're in touch with. And in the same manner than elementals, and they of course are these other entities, let's call them this way, are just participating on a daily basis in nature, in their own dreams, in the ways in which they relate to their own cosmology, and the way in which they relate to others. And these elements are embedded in their existence. They're not separated. Of course, for academic reasons nowadays, and from many years ago, of course, and in many different disciplines, we've separated these worlds to be able to understand and study them. But actually, these are things that are just, I don't know if you know this Moebius band.
Yeah, Mobius strip, yes.
The Mobius strip, which is basically, there's no in and out, it's just a continuation of the experience. And so this is how they relate to the world, and this is how they relate to sacred plants, to master plants. So I would like to, I like this contact because it allows me to understand that there are things that I might not know about, that I might not understand the depth, which are very simple things, but that they have them there as part of their everyday. And for us, they seem like magic. And these are only elements that are from nature and in nature, physics. And, it's so it is hard to talk about these topics for sure, because, how do we frame them in the Western world if it's not from the perspective of a psychosis? And they don't belong to these only. And even, well, there are many theories that we can talk about them in another session.
I mean, certainly even evoking the term psychosis introduces a like a very contentious spread of interpretations as to what that actually means, from the aberration of neurochemistry that needs to be adjusted through pharmacological agents to a larger spiritual process that is best served through a kind of like non-pharmacological integration process. And like these are totally different spheres. But so I don't know. I don't necessarily want you to go into that. I've actually had other episodes where we've talked about that with Dr. Tim Reed, for example, specifically. And I did a recent one on a Jungian take on schizophrenia. So I'll just leave that aside. Really big thing to put in your lap anyway. So I will not ask you to carry it. So let's just put that there. Okay. Let the listeners think about that on their own. Let's get right into really the water that we're swimming in. We're talking about integration and the experiences and so on and so forth on the basis, and I think a very reasonable assumption that people understand what integration is. And yet that isn't necessarily all that clear. So maybe you could share with us essentially now this is the opening to it, what exactly is integration? And what does it take to integrate an experience?
Well, integration is, bluntly, is the process that comes after the intake, where you explore the elements that came up during the intake and do something with them. A lot of people say that you make sense of them. But I also believe that there are things that you don't need to make sense of. Why? There are elements that I consider that timing is a very important thing, particularly in the work with sacred plants and in integration. And some things require us to leave them open for a while. So sometimes integration is thought of as, okay, let's just kind of think about the elements and then let's just interpret these elements. Integration is not interpretation by any means. First of all, because as integrators, we can't tell the other person what certain elements mean.
Sure, as the person facilitating integration of somebody else's experience with them.
Yeah. Exactly. We can't. We shouldn't. And that's a very delicate thing to do because you might as well be closing a whole experience for the person who went into the intake just by saying this means this or that, just because you have your dictionary of symbols. These experiences is broader than that. And if we understand this, depth, we can just respect the timing that these elements have. So I think that integration is a reorganization. I'm not sure I like the term integration, actually. And I know this is not going to be a very popular perspective, but integration would mean that we disintegrated ourselves within the work, which is true, because that would go against the notion of, finding this wholeness in the experience with plants. That's on one hand. And on the other hand, that would mean that we are basically disintegrated. And the only way to integrate would be to be able to do this work. Plants don't integrate anything, basically, even though we have these experiences as ego death and etc. But that's not, and the dissolution of the ego and whatever, that is a way of naming these experiences. But this is not a disintegration. This is not a disintegration. What I consider is that we reorganize things. And it's a very different perspective, because when we go into psychedelics, we unconsciously, let's say it, some of them, some people for sure consciously, but a lot of it is unconscious. we go into psychedelics because there are things that are not entirely in their place any longer. So we go, not everyone, of course, some people just, want to explore the other worlds and whatever. But, one main notion is that we go into psychedelics because there's something we want to change. There's something that we don't agree with anymore. And there's something that we just don't feel comfortable with anymore. So when we come out of it and we go to integration or reorganization, there are things that we don't need to reintegrate. There are things that we need to just allow them to end up falling apart. Because if we want to just pick up the pieces, then we're not allowing this process to follow its own nature, because the certain elements have already expired even before going into psychedelics. And when we go into the psychedelic experience, what we encounter is that we encounter the reality, let's call it this way, of these things having expired already, but we didn't know, or we didn't notice it.
Can you clarify what that means? Like, what kind of things are these, like things that have expired already?
So let's say that someone comes back and says, a lot of people have, there are processes in which people say, I really need to change these elements in my life. I'm so tired of them. I don't like my job. I don't like my marriage. I don't like myself. I don't like a bunch of things. And when you make, you work in the history of that, you realize that this didn't begin with the intake. It didn't happen in the intake. This has a whole history, having already started long ago. So these elements were already falling apart, but they weren't clear enough, or they were kind of made to the side, kind of repressed, if we want to use this term. And when someone goes into psychedelics and these cannot be held anymore in a whole, and they're shown how these things had already expired, but we were holding on to these elements because of the difficulty of actually grieving them and doing the work of, changing or letting them go, or whatever strategy you would think of.
So, I mean, I have two questions here. One of which I think it's kind of cheeky because I know there isn't actually a clear answer, or at least I assume there isn't. The other one is just very diverse and might be difficult to answer. So the one that I think is difficult and diverse is like, what, on sort of like boots on the ground, we could say, does integration, reorganization, what might it look like? Like, are there particular practices, or are there particular actions? I mean, I like this idea of like some things need to just give them the space to breathe. It makes me think of, I had Rachel Harris on my show about her book Swimming in the Sacred, and she had talked about something she had learned from a female guide around some insights you work on, and other insights you need to let them work on you, which takes time. But so this is the first kind of part of this question, which is like, what does it actually look like from the outside, from a practical perspective? And the other one, which I think is a bit cheeky, is, what does an effectively integrated ayahuasca experience look like? Like, how do you know, like, all right, I'm done, got it, good, integrated or organized? Yeah, those are the two questions. I'll let you address them however you like.
Okay, of course, that depends, right, on each experience. But the practices about, and I think I drifted a little bit with the first question of what integration is. But basically, integration would be to reorganize certain contents that came up during the intake, and discerning. I think that this is the very important word and notion, which is discerning what elements I need to take into account, which elements I really don't need any longer, which elements seem familiar, which elements I would like to work on in the future as well, because not everything can be worked on in a couple of sessions or in the integration sessions themselves. So there are several practices, of course, like meditation, breath work, like grounding techniques, right? Contact with nature is one of the most important, I would say. Exercise, I consider one of the most important as well, which is the contact with your own body. A lot of the people who come out of, let's say that they kind of got stuck, a lot of them are experiencing like a huge overflow of adrenaline still. So they do need to kind of burn it through exercise or, kind of activities where they sweat very much so that they can, re-experience the body. Other people might find stillness much more important because the experience was very rough, and they kind of need to come back to a place of non-movement and of steadiness. I work with sound a lot. I think that sound allows to ground yourself and focus, and sometimes it gives a lot of rest to the mind. And I also think that, food is so important. High dense foods are very important as well to ground the experience. And then there are, the art, the whole art spectrum, as mandalas or just any kind of art, dancing, writing, a lot of people like journaling. I do think that talking about it is one of the most important, because when you talk about these experiences, you listen to yourself. When you listen to yourself, you're able to understand where these elements, or you can understand where these elements come from, where these elements can be put, where these elements are just taking a lot of space that is not needed. When you talk about them, you can also recognize where these elements have been kind of, where they have been exaggerated as well, because when you talk about it, it's very different. It takes another shape than when you just think about the contents. When you think about the contents, in a lot of cases after the intake, they seem so big, they seem so enhanced, so out of order. When you talk about them, you kind of begin to limit them, and you cut certain excesses from the whole experience. How does an intake, or how do contents look like when they're integrated?
So let's take a pause there. I want to ask you this question specifically about talking about it. Is there such a thing as talking about it too soon, or waiting too long to talk about it? And with that, are there certain people that we should talk to about it and certain people that we shouldn't?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's too soon or too late. I do think that might be in the hands of the listener to manage, Because when I hear some contents that I consider that they're not fully, they don't really have a shape yet, that they kind of feel that they're not in a place where it's possible to work on them, that the person who's talking about them is not quite sure or has not a lot of clarity about what to do with it. Some things there, the recognition is to how do we leave these open to allow this to continue working? So we can approach it from other angles. So it's not like leaving it there abandoned, but actually just not getting to the core. Because there are things that you can't get to the core immediately. You need to work them by layers. That is very difficult for someone to know if it's within you, how to navigate it through layers. That's you. And if you go through it already, then that's it. You're ready to work on it, right? So we pretty much would follow, that's the way I work. I follow the pace of the person who's talking. And I can listen to some elements that maybe require a little bit of other elements or other layers first. And then there are other things that might have strings, like stronger strings to other things that we would like to wait and not just go and, get those core elements, because it might just be too much.
And with respect to who we talk about our experiences with, my first assumption and generally my suggestion is to just be cautious sharing deeply meaningful experiences with people who don't understand. The language I often use is, the precious thing that is your experience can easily be tarnished by even well-meaning hands. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions with respect to sort of identifying or, deciding, like who is and isn't maybe a good person to share your experiences with, other than the obvious, like if someone is like hard conservative anti-drug, probably don't tell them you took ayahuasca perhaps, or ask them to hold your space for a difficult experience. But like, other than the sort of glaringly obvious things, like, do you have any thoughts on that?
Let me shift it a little bit. I would say that we can be cautious of how we respond to someone talking about their experience, because we might think that we have a lot of information and we want to kind of help out the person who's talking to us. And with our responses, we might just be giving information that shouldn't go there. And we are kind of interfering with the experience of this person because we don't know where this person is at with their own content. So I would say that we can refrain ourselves from giving a lot of information to the people who have just come out of a journey. But flipping and going to your original question, I would say that it is true that when we come out of a session, of an intake, I would say that it is important to wait a little bit in terms of who we talk to. One of the elements is because of this that I just said. Sometimes it's so soon that we just came out of the experience that we don't really have clarity about what we would like to say. And when we talk about it, we give a lot of it. We have a lot of interpretations of our own work. We want to organize it so quickly, to gain clarity and to be kind of so fast that we might just be adding things that are not there. Now, talking to someone, we know that one of the suggestions that we hear a lot is that after an intake, you should wait around a month to actually even talk about the experience, some people say. And I don't necessarily agree. But that to make changes or to, do things with the information that you received, you should wait.
As in
Why?
to act on the insights, you should wait.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why? Because your perception has shifted for sure during the intake, and it takes time to come back to a certain place where you can discern how to decide on what to do about this. So it's the same thing as talking to someone who might not even understand what you're talking about. Some people have never done psychedelics and they don't really understand what it is to go through them. And some people might want to just kind of ground the experience with whatever they have at hand. And if they haven't been through the experience, it's really hard for them to actually, give an informed opinion or at least know how to respond about it, right? So I'm not really, I don't really agree with the readings, let's say, of dreams, which is something that we can fall into when integrating, which is that you basically read the symbols in a very literal way. And that I think is just, it's an easy mistake to make, right? Because you can't abstract the symbol from the narrative. So if you have someone who understands or who is acquainted with these elements, maybe they can, navigate with you the content. If there is someone who just haven't had the experience, I wouldn't recommend it. But, sometimes people don't have anyone to talk to and they just want to let this out. And sometimes you only need someone to be able to listen because you listen to yourself. So you reorganize certain things by listening to yourself through others.
Yeah, I guess like bonus points if in advance, you just need someone to listen and you ask them to do that for you. Like, can you just listen and just like ask me to expand on things rather than giving your interpretation? That'd be helpful.
Yeah.
And I just want to clarify, this is something that came up in, so I had Geronimo from iSeers on the show several episodes back talking about the course that I'm in now, through which I was, encountered your work. And he talked about the sort of like the pitfall or the possible harm of ayahuasca told me that, and discussed why, it's good to wait a little while before you start taking any explicit, especially like extreme actions based on your journey, like selling your house, moving to Costa Rica, quitting your job, divorcing your partner, etc. Although, and I'm bringing this back in because from what I understand, what he said, and I assume you agree, is that applies to everything that isn't getting yourself out of harm's way. For example, if ayahuasca says, stop doing drugs or stop drinking, probably you don't have to wait a month and a half to put that into practice, or, like go to a women's shelter because you're being physically abused at home. You don't have to wait a month to figure out whether or not ayahuasca was giving you good advice on in this respect. Would you, I assume you agree, or would you like to clarify more so on my comment there?
No, I agree. I think that discernment is just very important on that regard, because you also, when you go into a psychedelic journey, you also have clarity about a bunch of things like right away. Sometimes it's not that the plan told you, or I know that this is the way in which it's framed. It's something that you kind of understood immediately. Let's call it this way, right? You made conscious something that was already there. So when you're working with the plant, you suddenly hear something, or you see something that's super clear and straightforward. Why wouldn't you act on it if it's on your preservation or, for your health? So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Although I assume discernment can be compromised after the experience. That's part of why it's best not to sell your house and move to Costa Rica right away. Cut your hair, dye it pink. But yes, this is great. Let's go back to the sort of like that other part of the question that I sort of like intervened on. What does a completed integration look like with respect to ayahuasca?
From which perspective? But generally speaking, I would say that if for someone something got steadier, more clear, and able to manage, that will be integrated. It doesn't mean that it's over, because some contents require time. So you might talk about it, and like the first question or the first approach is kind of clear to you. And then you can say, okay, for the reason I came for, like it's fine, it's already done. I do need to work on the elements surrounding my question. You might. Can I work them in a couple of sessions? Probably not. Would I need more time to unfold these elements because they are complicated or intricated with other elements? Yes. So if that's the case, maybe you did integrate the specifics of the journey, but maybe you find out in the integration that there were other elements that you didn't know of, but that they open up. Those elements might require from you to unfold them throughout time in a more in-depth process. So as you see, it's important to understand where these end up, but to also discern where these might have strings attached to other elements from your life.
Maybe like a gross example, gross like granular, not purgative, might be something like if in my ayahuasca experience, it's like, I'm an alcoholic, I'm harming myself by drinking, I should stop drinking. And I like effectively stop drinking. I could say that in some respect, I integrated that part of my ayahuasca experience by finishing up my drinking. But in stopping drinking, I came to recognize that I was drinking because I have this long history of abuse in my family. Then I could say that I've integrated the stop drinking part of my ayahuasca experience, but now I've got all this other stuff that I need to work on that isn't necessarily integrating the ayahuasca experience. It's this sort of deeper well within me. Did I kind of get a good example from that?
Exactly.
Is there anything specific with ayahuasca integration that differs from other psychedelics?
I wouldn't say so. Not from my perspective. The thing is that there are elements that differ, yes, in what you find during the process. So the journeys are different. So you kind of see different things that might evoke different references. So I would say that that's the only way in which they would, it would change. Otherwise, the same person, the person is the same. And I would say that the integration is within the person, not necessarily the element. Although considering what other references does that psychedelic provide, yes.
Okay. So what there's the obvious answer to this question, which is like somebody is in crisis, right? But there might be a lot more nuance from what I understand to the sort of things that come up with respect to this next question, which is, what have you come to see as the most common challenges people are facing coming out of an ayahuasca experience? And any advice you would offer to someone with respect to them facing those common challenges?
Well, I think one of the most prevalent ones is that they heard something, that they received information, and they don't know what to do with it. And these navigating the I was told by the plant to do this or that, and so I should. So, making a pause there where you received information, because again, and this is something I emphasize, you're not giving away your own agency when you work with plants. And sometimes the idealization of the work with the plant allows or provokes that someone wants to give in to whatever they received during the journey. So that means that what even very crazy things, right? They're willing to do just because they were told, and they feel that they don't have a saying in any of these, but that they should just follow.
Like a complete projection of their own inner authority onto the plant.
Yes, they just lose it. They say like, okay, if I went to this, journey, I should do whatever I've been told, and I should not even question it. That is a tough one, because people are just in a stage where they don't even question it. They're just allowing anything to happen because that's what they've been told. And they think, some of these people think that they're misrespecting the plant if they question it and if they don't follow along, because they're not, and they fear like a celestial punishment. Plants don't work that way. And I often say plants will never tell you to do something that harms you, ever, right? It doesn't work that way. And if that's the message, we need to question that and where it can come from and what is it made of. I've been listening a lot to people who lost meaning in life. This is a very sad one, right? Because people don't find themselves anymore. And they don't know what they lost. They don't know how it happened. They don't know how to find any meaning to hold on to. And this is, of course, affecting their lives, their work, their, partnerships, their relationship with the kids, their relationship with, their partners and their own beings in the world. So, that I think what to do in that regard. Well, I think that requires a long time work, because that means working on what was the meaning before going into psychedelics, and what was already happening that was kind of dislocated, that when you went into psychedelics ended up kind of separating entirely. And entirely, I mean, to that degree where you think that then there's something lost. And then work on the grief of losing something that's accompany you all your life. That must be worked on as well. And then rebuilding that sense, which in a way does take into account all the elements that you didn't know you also had, or that you might pick up anew. I don't know if that was too complex.
I mean, when you talk about coming out the other side of a psychedelic experience and having lost all sense of meaning in life, that's pretty complex. So I don't know how you could explain it in a clear-cut package, obviously, because each individual is unique. Their lives are unique. What it takes to find meaning in their lives is unique. I have a question about, so what about people who they just had a huge experience? It was just really big and they don't really know what to do with it. They're not necessarily upset. They're just totally caught off guard with what the hell am I supposed to do with whatever that was, from the perspective of how it expanded their sense, say, of reality, of possibility, of their own mind. And they're sort of less grasping for some kind of stability or something. What would be your advice on something like that?
The taking some distance from the experience is important. And how does that look like? How does that look like? It's like kind of seeing these elements that come up, the things that you saw, you heard, or you went through during the journey, kind of put them in perspective, which is sort of putting them in kind of a, on a screen in front of you kind of thing, and understand that not everything needs your understanding. Not everything requires you to grasp each and every meaning that thing might have. There are elements that if you just kind of separate a bit from them, like, okay, I'm going to see them as a movie, let's call it this way, right? I'm going to put them in front of me and just kind of allow them to play out, right? Okay, I don't know what this element means, and I don't know how this is playing in my life. All right, I shouldn't rush. I can give time for these to unfold, because there's also this intelligence that we do have, and this sensitivity that we do have. And sometimes we require a little bit of distance, not a lot of apprehension. I know it's hard to go through it, but as much as possible to kind of put a certain filter between the rawness of what we found and ourselves, because we might not understand everything, and that is just fine. I hear a lot of people being desperate because they can't remember something that happened, but they need to. And I'm like, no, whatever you are able to process will be there for you to process. And whatever you forgot, just let it go. You don't have to hang on to each and every single detail. Some things will come back when they're in their own timing. So you don't have to be apprehensive about these things. And as much as you allow these things kind of tell their own story, then you can also, this is where agency comes in. Because you can see something that's telling you a story, right? Because you're seeing the whole screen with the elements that you allow to be put in front. And then there's this element that's telling you a lot of things. And you can say, okay, from what I'm being told, some of these things don't make sense and they're super disturbing. So I'm just not going to work on them right now. I'm just going to leave them where they are. That's it. That is possible. You're not a subject to any of the contents that you find. You can draw them. You can sing them. You can dance them. You can turn them into stories. You can turn them into your art, whatever that is, or you can turn them into something if you wish. But if you also would like to just leave them there, it's fine. The elements that are ready for you to work on will come back naturally. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of like it sounds like you're really giving a lot of agency back to people. It's like even if something feels overwhelming, like you don't, I mean, for me, what ends up happening when I work with people who have experiences that are really big and they don't understand how to make sense of that within the frame of reality, especially things that there's like we talked about the entities discussion earlier, where psychology, the interpretation is a kind of treason in that respect, right? Where it's like, if I psychologize it and say like, those are just projections of your mind, or I overly spiritualize it and say those are exactly what you saw them to be and you need a shaman to work them or something. I, in some respect, am in taking that person's agency away from them. And what I end up suggesting to people is like, well, I don't know if what you experience is or isn't true. And I don't think it's valuable for me to tell you whether or not I believe they're true. But what it sounds like is you're struggling a lot with the uncertainty it's introduced into your life. And it might be valuable for you to work with the sense of uncertainty you're feeling rather than trying to figure out whether or not what you experienced was real. Yeah.
So let me tell you a story. Well, it's not a story. It's my own experience with mushrooms, right? I did this journey of, I don't know if it was 5 or 7 hours on a car, traveling to go to the mountains, right? In Oaxaca, where mushrooms began.
Oh, the journey was like a literal journey. That wasn't your psychedelic journey. You were on a literal, like a road trip. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. A trip, right.
Yeah.
So I went with these people that I knew, some of them, but not all of them. And that was a very heterogenic group, right? I have worked with plants before. A lot of them hadn't. So anyways, we ended up in this place that it was far away. It was like this tiny house from a curandera, very respected curandera, not well known to the outside, but in the community, she was a very, very respected one. And I went with this friend and researcher. He has a lot of work with mushrooms, with psilocybin in Mexico. And we got there. I prepared a lot, of course. I dieted. I did whatever I needed to do else. It was a very simple ceremony. It was in the house, inside the house in chairs. They gave us our mushrooms full of dirt and full of, and so we ate them. There was just very little everything. Like the ceremony was a very simple thing. And it was a very small ceremony. And the journey in itself started. And well into it, I was like, why am I not having any visuals? Like I came all this way and this is just like a plain experience of nothingness. I began being super anxious, right? I was like, what am I doing here? Like I came all this way. What is happening? I ate the mushrooms just as everyone. Is this, I started doubting. I started being very upset. And I struggled for a while with the experience because I was questioning everything. And it got to a point where I said, okay, so I'm not finding anything. I don't see anything. I don't feel anything. I'm just struggling. What about if I work with nothingness? I don't like it because I wanted like the shiny things about the experience, and else. What if this is what I need to get acquainted with? It seems that I'm trying to push the experience towards where I would like it to be. And I don't think I'm listening enough. It took me a while to get to that point. I was already upset and I was like, I blamed everyone and everyone in my life and everyone there. And until I was able to say, okay, I will not resist this because it's very tiring and I'm here and it's only been 2 hours, and we're going to be here for at least 4 more. So what am I going to do with this? And when I said that, when I was able to just listen and got steady in the experience, still nothing happened, but that was what was happening. And it made it so clear to me in ways that I was behaving and feeling in my life. So I managed to connect that situation of desperation of me trying to get the effects that I wanted, the results that I wanted to meet my expectations. And that was in my life in general. So that was a very interesting, simple experience that It gave me so much, so much. And I really appreciated the experience of just, connecting to the simpleness of the experience of, okay, I'm just going to sit here and allow whatever there is.
Mm. It reminds me of actually out of a mushroom experience as well. An important insight I had a number of years ago, where I would get in and there'd be these feelings that would come up, and I wouldn't be able to. I thought that they were in the way. These feelings are in the way, like they're blocking my process. Until at some point, the mushroom stepped in and said something to me to the effect of, the feelings you think that are in the way of your process are the feelings you came here to process. And I was like, ooh, damn mushrooms. Yeah. So it sounds very related. There's this almost like taking a climb up or down the ladder of abstraction or something, like sort of dipping out of the content level of the struggle and realizing there actually is a process unfolding that we think the thing that is not happening is the thing that is happening or something.
Exactly.
So we're you know what, I've still got so many questions for you. You're just a wealth of knowledge and experience, and there's no way we're going to get through them in the time that we have left. But what I feel like I and the listeners would really be sort of like have missed out on if I didn't ask you is, with respect to somebody who shows up in your clinic or online through iSeers or otherwise, they show up and they are acutely in crisis. They had an experience, and whatever it is that happened, they are acutely in crisis. Perhaps they feel like they were traumatized by the experience, or whatever it is. They're in crisis. What generally is like, what is your course of action? I guess this is a number of questions, like how do you address this? But I'm asking that almost from the perspective of, is there somewhere in that also translates into advice for any individuals who might be experiencing crisis, or any individuals who have someone in their life that are in crisis directly following a psychedelic experience? I know that's like 3 questions, but I'll let you sort of like tackle it however you like. Ooh, take a little glass of water is the big one. Yeah.
You see, as much as I consider agency an essential part of all of us that we're working with these elements, I do consider that we work well in community. We listen ourselves through others. We learn from ourselves through others. I'm not saying, and this is something that I think is misunderstood, that then this notion of codependency, it's absolutely wrong. We were born dependent, and that's the elements that we're able to work on are with others, not ourselves alone. Just because we're super clever, we're super trained or intelligent, or we have a lot of experience. It is with others that we go about the most difficult moments in our lives. So you can work a lot on yourself in the work with psychedelics. That's another, basically. If we get into this notion, psychedelics is an other. And we're working with others. So if someone is in a crisis, I consider that going with another is of utmost importance. Someone who's able to listen from a perspective of a crisis given, from an acute crisis, from the ways in which to stabilize a crisis. Because you see, the crisis has any crisis has a breaking point that I consider is the most important place where we need to intervene. So basically, the Gauss curve.
No, I don't. I'm not familiar with the term, but as in like a kind of bell curve kind of thing?
Exactly. Yeah, the curve.
Yeah.
So basically, the crisis would be at the top, right? But when someone is stabilizing the crisis, in the following steps from the peak are the most important ones, not the peak. The peak is someone who's just out of themselves, right? But to do something about the experience comes when you're coming out of the peak, when you're just out of it. We need to intervene there to be able to do something about the crisis. Because when we're at this point, all things are shifting. And this is the place where we can introduce new notions. And this is basically following at the same time the model of new connections in your brain as well. So when you're in that point, it is important to introduce these new representations, these new behaviors, these new understandings, these new information so that you can take it in, organize it, and then act upon it. So as much as you can practice on your own, for sure, and you can do a lot of on your own, I would say that that you can ask for help, that you can go to others, talk about it, maybe use other resources that are not necessarily by talking, although talking for me works. There. So that you're able to reorganize these things, basically. So I wouldn't not take into account the work with others, just because of everything that you said.
Now, this is kind of assuming that you're past that sort of crisis point. Like it's possible that people can get into the crisis point and be stuck there for a while, or, heaven forbid, take actions that end themselves before leaving that place, or become so destabilized that getting to the other side of that curve might not happen for quite a long time, if ever again, from what I understand. Any perspective for, if an individual is at that level of crisis, they're probably not listening to this podcast with the capacity to take intelligible advice, so it might be for others around them. Any perspective or advice there, for example, like how could I say, as somebody seeing somebody else, like how do I know when it's time for me to intervene? Is there such a thing as it being relevant to, intervene such that somebody goes to a crisis hotline or, hospitalization? Any thoughts on that when we're really getting into the potential danger zone of somebody either harming themselves or being harmed long-term psychologically because of the crisis?
So we would generally say that someone needs help when the disturbance has taken over several aspects of their lives. So when they have lost their jobs, they're not eating well, they're not sleeping well. Sleeping is one of the most important aspects to look into. Sleeping, food, and mood. So if I see that someone is more irritable, right? And someone is more susceptible to words, to messages, to the weather, even to new things. So someone who's more sensitive, we would take the person in a baseline, right? We more or less know someone. So whatever moves to the extremes of that baseline, that can tell us that someone is in crisis. So if we know someone who was, more or less, angry at life, but we now see that this person is just unbearable, right? We can assume that there's something going on.
Or
So
perhaps the opposite. Now everything is absolutely amazing and like the world is just like pouring blessings out everywhere and I can see the truth and the light and every little sign, for example. Yeah.
that would be a maniac crisis, I would say. But yes, so if we take into account the baseline, I think that this can help us. If we take the baseline of that person, particularly that person, not other persons, not in the comparison with others, but that person in the comparison with themselves, whatever peaks under or over exaltation or depression, I would say, those are like the extremes. That and the persistence of these disturbances in time would give us a clear picture that someone is having a hard time. So, three elements basically. One is the extremes to which the experience is going, the disturbance in many different areas of the life of someone, and the persistence of the disturbance. So by areas, I mean social, emotional, job, family, and the relationship to the world.
Sure. Finances, personal health, personal hygiene. Yeah.
Exactly.
And I guess like, is there, okay, what's the question here? I'm wondering, like, I guess like one suggestion, they could be like, hey, there's this organization that you can fill out a form and you can have a series of integration sessions that are no upfront cost to you. It's called iSeers. Right? You could suggest to them. Is there anything that, like, is it at times relevant to have somebody hospitalized if you feel like these disturbances are significant enough? Like, do you feel like that's the case, or do you feel like no?
I have my own perspective about hospitals and seclusions, I would say. Many years ago, I created an organization to actually work with people in crisis so that they wouldn't get to psychiatric wards or hospitals, because the after effects of these hospitalizations sometimes are worse. And I know that medical systems around the world fail enormously to actually address profoundly, and effectively the situations that people go through, particularly when in crisis. However, if there is an acute risk and we don't think that we can contain the risk,
acute risk of, say, self-harm or harm of others.
Yes, okay. And self-harm can be someone who stops eating, right? It's not like they're not aggressive towards themselves, but they've lost meaning, they lost the sense of things, and they have given up, basically. So they don't have hygiene, they don't take care of themselves. They lose contact with, regular activities to preserve their lives. And we can't contain that because that can be something that overpowers the capacity of someone to actually push the person to do something. Then I would say yes. And I'm sure that there are organizations around the world that are not necessarily hospitals or psychiatric wards, but that they can do, for example, therapeutic accompaniment in the place, which is something that I hold in dearly to my heart because it works pretty well. Then I would choose that better. But if there are no other resources, yes.
Okay. Yeah, this has been very informative. Thank you very much. Is there anywhere you'd like to direct listeners from here? For example, anywhere they could follow your work in private practice and or the ICEERS support line, what are the links, maybe social media handles that you'd like to leave listeners with today?
Well, I'm just creating my website because I have a lot of work, but scattered around the web. But anyone can, contact me through my email, which is my name and my last name, Mijal Schmidt at gmail.com. Eventually, I'll have my website, but I'm also in LinkedIn, which is like the place where I've gathered sort of my experience. I'm starting this integration project called Icarar Integración, which is basically as integration, but with a C instead of a T.
Okay.
And that's on Instagram, and it's beginning as a private project. That's my private practice project. And of course, ICEERS, the website of ICEERS, you can follow along, and there's the questionnaire that you fill up to receive sessions as well.
Well, I will make sure all of those links are in the show notes of this episode at jameswjesso.com. And when such a time comes in the future that your website is fully up and operational, let me know, and I'll sort of retroactively go in and ensure that link is included too. So if someone's listening to this in 2-3 years time, or even 6 months time, I don't know how long it'll take.
Yeah.
Websites are a huge deal, or ordeal at times. I'll make sure all the links are there. Again, Mijal, thank you so much for your time today.
James, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me here. And thank you everyone who listened.
And cut. Okay, that was the interview with Mijal Schmidt. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, all the links that Mijal mentioned there will be in the show notes of this episode at jameswjesso.com, and you can quickly link over to that through the link that's in the description to this episode. As I mentioned before the interview began, if you are interested in being a financial contributor to the show, you can sign up for Patreon and make a pledge of a monthly amount that makes sense to you. As little as a cup of coffee really does go somewhere. It's all something and adds up to my capacity to earn an income doing this work without relying on advertisement or, trying to stay in line with what's trending in the algorithm, to instead just focus on what I believe to be the most valuable, especially in coordination and, conversation with my patrons. So patreon.com/JamesWJesso to sign up. Financially or non-financially is also an option if you want to just stay in contact. Alternatively, for contact, you can sign up for my newsletter or my Telegram group. That's all. So links are all in the description of this episode, wherever you're checking it out. I'm really grateful that you tuned in today and that you tuned in and listened all the way to the end. So thank you for that. And until the next episode, take care.